درود بر شما. به گفتگوی ویژه خوش آمدید. در طول ماه‌های اخیر و در هنگامه خیزش ملی مردم ایران، سیاستمداران اندکی از سراسر دنیا به حمایت تمام قد از مردم ایران و خواست ملی اونها برخاستند. امروز و در برنامه گفتگوی ویژه میزبان یکی از سیاستمداران از پارلمان فدرال بلژیک هستم. آقای سام van Rooy که در طول ماه‌های اخیر با مواضع صریح و ایران دوستانه خودشون بارها در مجامع عمومی، در پارلمان بلژیک و در رسانه‌های جمعی در حمایت از مردم ایران سخن گفتند و همیشه بر این نکته پافشاری کردند که باید خواست ملی مردم رو به رسمیت شناخت. امروز و در آستانه 26مین روز از شروع عملیات نظامی امریکا و اسرائیل در حمایت از مردم ایران، پای صحبت‌های آقای van Rooy میشینیم. روزهایی که بسیار حساس، پرتنش و پر اضطراب هست برای همه ما. آقای van Rooy بارها در مواضع خودشون در رسانه‌های اجتماعی و در پارلمان بلژیک بر خواست ملی مردم ایران پافشاری کردند و همواره از حقوق اونها مبنی بر داشتن دموکراسی، لیبرالیسم و سکولاریسم دفاع کردند. خانم ها آقایان، من رولا زمزمه هستم. به گفتگوی ویژه خوش آمدید.
Fox News can confirm that Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, is dead.
Ayande Iran, Javid Shah, make Iran great again. Long live Iran and the Iranian people. Khamenei is dood en het islamitische regime staat op omvallen. Dit is een fantastische dag in de geschiedenis van de mensheid. Ongelooflijk. En nu moeten we vooral verder Israël en de Verenigde Staten steunen om het islamitische regime volledig te vernietigen, zodat we een vrij Iran kunnen hebben met Reza Pahlavi.
Hi, dear Mr. van Rooy, thank you very much for accepting my invitation for this conversation. On behalf of all of the Iranian, first of all, I would like to appreciate your statements in supporting of the Iranian. And for the first question, I would like to ask, how do you evaluate the situation at the moment in the Middle East and Iran, especially that we are in the eve of the 26th day of US and Israel military action in support of Iranian people? How do you see the situation and how do you evaluate the result?
Well, sometimes it's difficult to say, of course, what exactly is happening on the ground since there is no internet for the Iranian people. But of course, I follow closely every day the communication that comes from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, and of course from the US military and the US government. And my estimation is that the US, but especially Israel, is every day targeting IRGC members, jihadists, and Basij also. Since some days, they really started with targeting Basij forces and jihadists, which is extremely important, of course. So I have a lot of hope that Israel is doing what is necessary in order for the Iranian people to be able to rise up in a safe way. Because that is, of course, what is necessary, that they can rise up for the last time. They've been doing that already for many times since 47 years. But every time they got shot, they got killed, they got tortured. And now for the last time, they need to be able to rise up in a safe way. And I can only hope that that will be possible one of the coming days or weeks.
We are passing the days that we can hear some voices about the negotiations between the United States and the Iranian authorities. And whenever the name of the negotiations comes, all of the Iranian, they're afraid. Do you think that this negotiation could be escalating and could be done? Or if this negotiation happened, what is your evaluation from the result of these negotiations?
Honestly, I don't really think that there are serious negotiations going on. I think it's a signal that maybe the US wants to give, that Donald Trump wants to give to the world or to the leftovers of the Islamic Republic to make them confused about, who is negotiating and what is he saying. But I honestly believe, and I hope it, of course, but I honestly believe that Trump and Netanyahu don't have real intentions to negotiate with this horrible regime. I think from the beginning, and still, they have the goal to get rid of this horrible Islamic regime, and they will not negotiate.
During the last 47 years, the Iranian almost examined many ways and the solution toward the Iranian regime, and they start to negotiations, they use their elections and their votes, and they also wish that this negotiation never happens. In this case of the negotiation, how do you see the role of the European countries and European organizations, especially the European Council, European Parliament, and European Commission, toward Iran's arbitrary problems? And do you think that they could do their efficient role toward Iran and the problem inside the Middle East or not?
Well, to be really honest, the European Union is weak, is very weak in terms of military power, but is also weak psychologically. It's these people from the European Commission, the leaders of the European Union, and also most leaders of the nation states in Europe, especially in Western Europe, they are cowards. So I don't count on them. I don't think the Iranian people can count on them. I mean, what they should have done already for weeks, and they're still not really doing that, is support Israel and the United States. But they're not really doing that. No, they are doubting. They are, like I say, they are cowards, and they only think on the short term. They don't want to take any risk, because of course this war is a risk. Every war is a risk, and I think it's a risk that we should take, and that there is no alternative for taking this risk. The only alternative is that the Islamic regime stays in power and that the Iranian people keep suffering the coming years and decades. So we should support this war against these jihadist terrorists, but I don't see that in the European Union, unfortunately.
Yes, as you know, many Iranians believe that their struggle against the current regime is not only for their own freedom, but also for the security of the region and even in the wider world. In their view, the fall of the regime would remove a major source of instability in the world. Why do you think some European countries still struggle to recognize or act upon this perspective?
Yes, very good question. I think, first of all, they're being naive about the threat. They don't really realize how big this threat is. Because, they don't understand what the Islamic ideology and the jihadist vision on the world, on the Middle East, but also on the West. They don't really understand what it means. They think like Westerners, so they have a Western glasses on their head.
Exactly.
And they don't know how the Middle East works. They don't know how Islamic fundamentalists and jihadists, and in this case the ayatollahs and the mullahs, they have no clue how these terrible people think and what their goal really is. So their ignorance and their naivety, that is a main problem. Another problem is that they are cowards, so they're not willing to engage in a battle or in a fight, because that is what it is. If you admit that there is an enemy like the Islamic Republic, an enemy that wants you dead, yeah, then you have to fight. And most of these leaders, they don't want to fight. And we saw the same in the previous century. Before the Second World War, we had the rise of Nazi Germany, Hitler writing Mein Kampf, and it was exactly the same. Most Western leaders didn't want to see it, they closed their eyes, or they were cowards, unfortunately. And we see that exactly the same pattern we see today.
Het regime van Iran is in wezen de Sjiïtische versie van islamitische staat. Het is een moorddadig, jihadistisch sharia-regime, jihadistisch naar ons toe, een sharia-regime naar de Iraniërs toe. Iran is bezet. Het is bezet door het islamitische regime en het Iraanse volk wordt gegijzeld door de ayatollahs. Het ayatollah-regime had er trouwens nooit mogen zijn, met dank ook aan het Westen, en had allang op de vuilnisbelt van de geschiedenis moeten liggen. Prévost is hard tegen Israël en mild voor Iran. U bent dus hard voor de geallieerden en mild voor het islamo-nazisme.
And we Iranian, during the last 47 years, we shout that we are not only fighting for ourselves, we are fighting for the region and for the world, because they do not know, as you mentioned, the dangerous people, how dangerous people they are. As the next question, I would like to be back to the Belgium. How do you see the attitude of the Belgian government and the Belgian Parliament toward these current operations?
Well, it's more or less the same as we see in the European Union. I mean, Belgium is actually just a smaller version of the European Union, and we have a lot of leftist people, yes, and green people and communist people in the Belgian parliament and even in the Belgian government. And they hate Trump, they really hate Netanyahu, and only for that reason they will not take the side of the Iranian people and Trump and Netanyahu. They hate them too much. I've said earlier that they hate Trump and Netanyahu much more than they love human rights and dignity and freedom for the Iranian people. And that shows how hypocrite they are. I mean, when it comes to the Palestinians, for example, then they're all about freedom and independence and human rights, because of course they use the Palestinians to bash Israel and Netanyahu and to bash Donald Trump. But if it's the other way around, and Trump and Netanyahu, they do something very good for the Iranian people in this case, yeah, then they close their eyes, or they choose even the other side. And they say, this operation, Epic Fury and Rising, or Roaring Lion, I must say, it is against international law. They keep saying. And then I think, where were you the last 47 years with your international law for the Iranian people that got tortured, that got killed, that got threatened, that got raped? I mean, we never heard them. Never. Sometimes they made a stupid resolution, you know. It doesn't mean anything, resolution. The Islamic Republic, they couldn't care less about words or things on paper like a resolution. The only thing they understand, these jihadists, is power, is military power. And that is Israel and the US is delivering that. But the Belgian government, no, we cannot do that. It's against international law. It's against sovereignty. Then they use all these fancy buzzwords, you know, buzzwords that don't mean anything for the Iranian people. It makes me very upset, actually, that they are so, such hypocrites. It makes me very upset because, yeah, they actually don't really care about the suffering of the Iranian people. They don't have enough empathy for these people because their hatred for the right-wing Trump and Netanyahu and also my party, for example, is just too big.
In Iran, en ik weet eigenlijk niet of deze regering dat heel goed beseft, is al maandenlang een existentiële beschavingsstrijd aan de gang op leven en dood. Massa's ongelooflijk moedige Iraniërs riskeren hun leven en worden gemarteld, verkracht en of vermoord omdat ze eindelijk bevrijd willen worden van het moorddadige islamitische regime. Deze mensen hebben meer moed in hun pink dan heel het Belgische establishment tezamen. En het minste, minister, dat deze regering dus kan doen, is ervoor zorgen dat deze vrijheidslievende Iraniërs in ons land, die trouwens doorgaans ook een verrijking zijn, veilig zijn op ons eigen grondgebied. Deze regering zou er dus een prioriteit van moeten maken om alle agenten en aanhangers van de jihadistische massamoordenaar Khamenei en hun families op te sporen en te deporteren, te beginnen, minister, bij de Iraanse ambassade.
Normally in the international law, when we are close to overthrow a regime, the international community starts to negotiate with the opposition out of the country or inside the country. In your point of view, I would like to ask why the European countries of the Westerners they do not start negotiation, especially with the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, which many of the Iranians shout his name during the demonstration inside Iran, and most of the Iranian outside Iran, the Iranian diaspora in many countries like Germany, Belgium, United States and Canada, Australia, they shout his name. Why they do not start negotiations with the leader of the opposition, especially Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi? Do you think that this negotiation could be something fault in diplomatic manner, or you have another idea?
Well, first of all, I don't think that, again, that they really understand that so many Iranians, the majority, I would say, that once the Islamic regime gone, once Reza Pahlavi as at least as the person who does a transitional government for a democratic, for a free Iran, they don't really understand that. They don't know the history of Iran. They don't know the history of the Persian civilization. And the only thing they see is, the son of the Shah. And for them, they think then, that will be another dictator, and we should not put another dictator there. I mean, they're totally ignorant. And they also compare Iran with other countries, the Arab countries, like, for example, Syria, like, for example, Libya. And they make total wrong comparison. They think, oh no, the Arab Spring, it failed, so this will also fail. Because they don't understand that we're talking here about a total different situation, a total different people, with a total different country, a total different history, with a great potential of success. They don't see that. And the strange thing is that they were all cheering with the Arab Spring, And then I was saying, don't cheer, because this will bring the Muslim Brotherhood into power. This will bring jihadists into power. Because I know these countries. I know how the people in these Arab countries, the majority, how they think. The majority are very orthodox Muslims, are Muslim fundamentalists even. But in Iran, that is not the case. And so it's very different.
Iran is a totally different country, as you mentioned, geopolitically, historically, culturally especially. And the main issue is Iran is not a Muslim country at all. The Iranian people, they are not Muslim at all. And they have the same assumption toward Iran. And that's the point. I would like to be back to one of your statements about Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. I remember you told that it could be nice that the European society had a leader like Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. What did you see in his character and or his plans? And I would like to give more explanation about your statement and elaborate this for us. Thank you.
Maybe I can first say something else about Reza Pahlavi as an answer to your previous question, if it's possible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sure.
Because what is also the case is that most politicians in the parliament here in Belgium and in the European Union, they also don't follow the things that Reza Pahlavi has written and the things that he said in interviews. I'm sure that they're ignorant about the great plan that he has for Iran. I mean, he's been working on this for so many decades already that he knows exactly the situation. He knows exactly what needs to be done in Iran. And he has a great plan for bringing Iran back on track, you know, on the track that it deserves to be. A free country, a country where people can again thrive and have their talents out in the open, you know, to make Iran great again, as we like to say. But they don't know all that. They just see his name, Pahlavi. They think about the Shah. They don't know anything about the Shah. You know, they just hear some buzzwords like, oh, it was a dictator, blah, blah, blah. And that is what they base their opinion on, you know. So never underestimate the ignorance. Now, to answer your other question, I've seen so many interviews with Reza Pahlavi. And what I see is a very wise and intelligent man. He touches me as a person. When I see him talk, when I hear him talk, when I read his interviews, I see that this is a man who knows what he's talking about the Middle East, about Islam, about jihad, but also about the West. I mean, he's been living in the US. He speaks perfect the languages, French, English. I mean, he's a sophisticated man, and he knows the West not only very well, I would say he knows the West better than quite some Western politicians. I've seen that in his interviews, that he talked about the Islamization here in Belgium, for example. He talked about it. He gave an example about Brussels, how Muslim fundamentalists are also here taking over this country, especially in Brussels, also in Antwerp, where I live. And that is why I said we need leaders like Reza Pahlavi, also here in Europe, in the West.
Op het moment dat 30.000 tot 50.000 vrijheidslievende Iraniërs werden afgeslacht door het islamitische regime, op het moment dat jonge, vaak talentvolle Iraanse jongens en meisjes verdwijnen en worden verkracht of gemarteld door dit sharia-tuig, op het moment dat vrijheidslievende Iraniërs de Koran in brand steken, op het moment dat vrijheidslievende Iraniërs de jihadistische vlag verscheuren van de Islamitische Republiek van Iran, waar niet minder dan 22 keer Allahu Akbar op staat. En op het moment dat talloze vrijheidslievende Iraniërs zeggen, kijk maar eens op sociale media, minister, u zal het zien, dat zij zeggen dat ze genoeg hebben van de islam. En dat ze hun prachtige, eeuwenoude Perzische beschaving terug willen. Dat ze hun land willen de-islamiseren. Wel, op dat moment wil deze regering islamofobie aanpakken. Dat is, minister, en ik wik mijn woorden, dat is compleet gestoord. Want weet u, minister, wie ook steeds opnieuw zegt dat islamofobie moet worden aangepakt? Het islamitische regime in Iran. Jihadist Ayatollah Khamenei en zijn moordenaarsbende. Die zeggen al decennia dat islamofobie moet worden aangepakt. U bevindt zich dus in dat gezelschap. Besef dat maar goed. En deze regering zou zich diep moeten schamen dat ze die term, islamofobie, een jihadistische strijdterm, in één adem noemt met discriminatie, xenofobie en antisemitisme. Want hoe islamitischer een land, hoe meer discriminatie, hoe meer xenofobie, hoe meer antisemitisme. Dat is, en luister goed naar de uitdrukking, dat is een wet van meden en persen. Ik gebruik deze uitdrukking uiteraard zeer bewust, minister. En dus sluit ik af met te zeggen, concludeer ik, wie discriminatie, xenofobie en antisemitisme echt wil aanpakken, moet de term islamofobie verwerpen, moet de giftige islamitische leerstellingen over niet-moslims verwerpen, minister, en moet, jawel, de islamisering van ons land bestrijden.
I would like to be back to the European Union and the European nations. Do you think that in such a crucial and critical situation, the NATO could be able to intervene exactly and especially about the problems that we have in the Strait of Hormuz? And do you think that this intervene could be in the beneficiary of the European Union, or it could escalating and increasing the problem in the region?
Well, I think that Donald Trump is totally right when he says the NATO, that's me, that's the US, and not much other things matter. I mean, it's the US, that is NATO. And of course, when Donald Trump asks now to NATO countries to help in the Strait of Hormuz, yeah, they should help, of course, because it's a complex situation there, and you need a lot of volume to be able to open it again, this Strait of Hormuz. So I totally agreed with what Donald Trump said, that the US, helped Europe and European countries and other NATO countries so much in history. And now when he asks them to do something back in the Strait of Hormuz, yeah, they say no, and they don't want to, again, also because they're cowards, of course. And I know one thing for sure, also because they have a lot of Muslims in their countries, like France, for example. And this Macron, he's afraid, of course, when he would help Donald Trump, these Muslims would get very upset with him, and they are already a big problem in France. I mean, France is Islamizing very rapidly. So that is also one of the reasons why these European countries don't want to intervene, don't want to help the US. But of course, I think they should do that, and they should have done that already a week ago.
And exactly, we Iranian, we are wondering that we are trying to de-Islamizing our country. And the thing that really happened in the Europe and United Kingdom or United States, we are increasingly see that the Islamizing is going more and more every day. Do you have any specific plan in Belgian Parliament in order to confront with this situation?
Well, the first thing that needs to be done to stop Islamization is to stop mass immigration from Muslims, because that is what we have here in Belgium and in big parts of Europe, especially Western Europe, that every year 10,000s of Muslims come in to the country, come in Belgium. And of course, they are not all bad people. I'm not going to say that. But many of them, I think the majority, they have ideas. They have opinions about women, about democracy, about freedom of speech, about us, non-Muslims, you know. These are horrible opinions that they have. They believe in Sharia law. They applaud for jihadist terrorists. And we have so many of these people in our country. I mean, we've seen the demonstrations in front of the Iranian embassy from Muslims carrying the photo of the mass murderer Ali Khamenei. I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? That these people are here on our territory. It's a disaster. So we should stop letting them in. And of course, we need also remigration. I mean, if you want Sharia law, if you support jihad, if you support Hamas, if you support Khamenei or the Islamic Republic, you don't belong here. You don't belong in Belgium. You don't belong in Europe. You don't belong in the West. We should kick them all out. But of course, that is a very difficult thing to do, because many of them were even born here. And where can we bring them to? I mean, the countries of origin, they also don't want them back. They don't take them back.
Exactly. Many people, they say that the real Islam is not the same thing that they are pretending to show. But we Iranian people, we feel with our flesh and with our blood what is the real Islam is, you know. To be honest, I would like to tell that the problem is in Islam.
Of course.
You know? And many people, they try to ignore this, and they bring their ideologies in the Western Union, Western countries, and they try to continue to their habits that they had.
Can I add to this? It's even worse, because Islam gets even money from the state in this country. So many mosques, they get paid by the taxpayer. They have Quranic schools where children are being taught that non-Muslims, that you should not take them as friends, you should hate them, you should conquer them. And the taxpayer in this country pays for that horrible ideology. And now, since 60 years of this mass migration of Muslims, we see neighborhoods here in Brussels or in Antwerp, where I live, where you can walk through for minutes, for kilometers, and you only see Islam, Islam, Islam. You see hijabs, only hijabs. You see only halal stores. You see only mosques. You see only Quranic schools. And there's nothing Western anymore. There's nothing European anymore in these neighborhoods. You would think that you're in an Islamic country when you walk there, in Pakistan or in Morocco or in Saudi Arabia or Turkey, you name it. It's not Belgium anymore. It's not Europe anymore. It's Belgistan, as I like to call it. And that has to stop, because if we continue with this policy, then in 10 to 20 to 30 years, then all neighborhoods will be like this, you know?
And as I think, experienced journalist, I would like to state that, and maybe warn, if you don't try to find a good solution, in the near future, your children will start to talk Arabic.
Exactly.
And I saw that with my eyes, that the children in the European countries, they start to learn how to recite Quran or do prayers in Muslim ways. And I really wondered about that. For the next question, I would like to ask about the pro-Palestine people and some lefties that during the Iranian national movement called Lion and Son, they become silent. They said nothing. But apparently, the victims are the victims. There is no difference between the victims in Palestine or the victims in Iran. Why do you think that this happens in the European country, especially pro-Palestine people, and the European authorities did not start to react or make a specific solution toward them? Because we apparently know that some of them, they are supporting on behalf of Iranian regime, you know, and maybe this is one of the reasons. But I would like to know more about your ideas about the reaction of the lefties and pro-Palestine people about Iran during last month.
Well, Western Europe has become really leftist the last decades. So it means that they hate capitalism, which means they hate the United States, and especially Donald Trump, which means they hate also Israel, because these are free Western capitalist countries. Actually, they hate our own civilization. They hate the Western free civilization. And because they hate it so much, they will side with all enemies of Western civilization. And one of the biggest examples is, of course, the Palestinians and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and the Islamic regime, the Islamic Republic. So these leftists, they choose for the enemy because they hate their own culture, actually, their own civilization. And they even start shouting then jihadist slogans. And they start even admiring mass murderers like Ali Khamenei. It's unbelievable, these people. These people, they are crazy, but they're crazy in a very dangerous way.
It's a question for me. Do they saw anything bad from their own cultures during the past years or something like this?
Well, the problem is in education and in mainstream media. So when you grow up in Belgium or in another country in the west of Europe, you've been taught that your own culture, your own civilization is bad because we did some bad things in the past. We had, of course, the Second World War with the Holocaust, which was, of course, horrible. We had colonialism, which is, of course, horrible, but they've only been taught the bad things. They never hear that we have also a culture and a civilization to be very proud of, because we are free, we are democratic, we have equality of men and women, we have democracy. But that they don't hear. They only hear the bad stuff. So they start hating their own civilization and siding with the most horrible enemies of our civilization. And of course, in this case, they ignore as much as they can the suffering of the Iranian people. They ignore as much as they can what the Iranian people really want, which is to get rid of this horrible, murderous Islamic regime. They ignore that because if they don't ignore that, they have to side with the Iranian people and they have to side with Netanyahu and Donald Trump, which for them are two symbols of the West, of Western civilization, of our own culture, which they hate, unfortunately.
And I would like to add, unfortunately, the history is a harsh teacher. You know,
I know what you're going to say.
I hope that they could realize and understand sooner than it becomes late. It becomes very late because these countries like Iran, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, like Pakistan, they are in front of their eyes.
Yeah.
But they don't know about the important values of the democracy, important values of the gender equality that we are fighting for in Iran for 47 years, and we are suffering from the regime that imposes us this kind of torture and the problems that we have.
They take all these values for granted. That is what they do. They don't see how amazing and unique it is to have all these values, to have all these freedoms. They don't see it. And they don't understand also that all the countries, not only Iran, but like you said, also Afghanistan, also Iraq, also Syria, it used to be non-Islamic countries. Islam was born in the 7th century. The first jihadist was the Prophet of Muhammad, and he started Islamizing very rapidly whole parts of Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and also in Europe. But they don't understand this history or they don't know it. And so they make the wrong choice.
Minister, in Iran heeft zo pas een zoveelste massaslachting plaatsgevonden op vrijheidslievende Iraniërs. Op enkele dagen tijd werden naar schatting minstens 16.500 Iraniërs vermoord. 330.000 Iraniërs raakten gewond of werden verminkt. Dit is de 7 oktober 2023 van Iran, uitgevoerd door dezelfde moorddadige jihadisten, namelijk de Islamitische Revolutionaire Garde, IRGC, een van de belangrijkste sponsors van Hamas. Het islamitische regime verkracht, martelt en moordt erop los. En daarvoor importeren ze zelfs duizenden jihadisten uit Arabische landen. Weinig politici weten dit, maar Ayatollah Khamenei en de IRGC hebben tot doel de islamitische revolutie ook te exporteren buiten Iran. Het islamitische regime van Iran wil via het voeren van jihad ook de rest van de wereld, ook ons, islamiseren. Het is dan ook een van de grootste terreursponsors ter wereld. De screening in dit land, minister, is een lachertje. Want naast Iraniërs die een verrijking zijn voor onze samenleving, zijn er de afgelopen decennia ook heel wat aanhangers van het islamitische regime en agenten van de IRGC naar Europa en naar België kunnen komen. Zeker nu de Iraanse contra-revolutie hopelijk in de steiger staat, is het van fundamenteel belang, minister, dat Iraniërs die meewerken met dit moorddadige islamitische regime niet naar België kunnen komen. En dus is mijn vraag, minister, wat onderneemt u om aanhangers van het islamitische regime van Iran en agenten van de IRGC het land uit te zetten? En hoe zorgt u ervoor dat zulk jihadistisch tuig nooit naar België kan komen?
I would like to little move forward. We are in the very crucial days that the Iranian regime weakened too much. Apparently, the leaders, the commanders of IRGC and the security agents of Iran, they are murdered at the moment. And we can apparently see a chaos in governing head in Iran. My question is, do you think that the regime change will happen in Iran or no? Then I will ask my second question.
I hope so. And I think so. Every day when I wake up, I hope it happens. I'm sorry.
No problem. I truly feel your sensations and feelings, and we Iranian, Sam, believe me or not, we appreciate your pure sensations because you cried with us, you smiled with us, you danced with us. I never forget your presence in our gatherings in Belgium. And that's why we Iranian people love you in our heart.
My dear Iranian friends, my dear Iranian friends, let us start with the great news that we received today, because not only was the other Ali Larijani eliminated, also Soleimani. Thank you Israel, thank you to the brave heroes of the IDF for doing this, because too many people have suffered under this horrible Islamic regime. And I am ashamed, I am so ashamed as a Belgian, as a politician, that I see in this country, on our territory, that we have so many terrorist supporters in our country, not only being allowed in here, but also being allowed by the government to demonstrate here. We should keep them all out of this country. By demonstrating here, by demonstrating in front of the European Parliament, in front of the American Embassy, by demonstrating here in front of the horrible jihadist embassy, by doing all that. You are so courageous. You are not helping only freeing Iran, you are also helping Belgium to be free of Islamization. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Other politicians, the journalists, the activists that are now silent, they are cowards. They are on the wrong side of history. Because the right side of history is your side. It's the side of the courageous Iranian people. Long live Iran. Long live the brave, the proud, the great Iranian people. Payam de Iran! Payam de Iran! Payam de Iran! We gonna make Iran great again. Thank you. And we will make Iran great again. Mr. Reza Pahlavi, Shabi Shah, Shabi Shah, Shabi Shah, Shabi Shah.
And I would like to make a question on this and ask, what are the roots of this love toward Iranian in your hearts? Why this happens?
There are many roots, I would say. First of all, I just started studying the Middle East and Iran and Islam 20 years ago already, because it interests me a lot, this region. And of course, when you study it and you also get to know the people, then you realize, not only with your brain, with your mind, but also with your heart, what an amazing civilization Iran is, and what a proud and strong people the Iranians are, and how tragical their history is, with the Islamization in the 7th century to begin, and then later on in 47 years ago in 1979. So it touches me deeply how a people can suffer so much, had to suffer so much, still has to suffer so much under this horrible Islamic regime, while the Iranian people have so much potential, so much. It's a people I look up to, I have respect for. I have the same, more or less, with the Israeli people. with the Jewish people. They have also so much potential. They have also a history with so much suffering, and that touches my heart. And that only became stronger when it comes to Israel after October 7th, 2023. And when it comes to the Iranian people, that became only so much stronger since January, since the mass murders of January. And I must say that since then, I met so many Iranian people here in Europe, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands. And they give me so much love. I mean, they're such warm people. And I also notice that they're so talented. You know, I see on social media also, they follow me or send me text messages and so on. And sometimes I go look at their account to see who is this. And there are always people who are doing something, you know. They're not lazy. They're working, and they're busy with art or with literature or with writing or with music, you know. So again, this potential cannot be wasted anymore. And that is why I fight for it every day, and why it has become such, an obsession even. I say this honestly. It has become an obsession the last months for me, Iran and the Iranian people. Another thing that I realized again now in January, I knew it before, of course, but that is how courageous the Iranian people are. I mean, my problem in the West with many people, and especially politicians and journalists, is that I think they are cowards. They're not willing to fight. But in Iran, and also here in Belgium and in Europe, on the streets and on social media, I see so many Iranian people that are willing to fight and even to risk their lives to go on the street to protest. And that is something for me that is beyond my imagination. You know, I try to realize what does it mean to leave your house, to go on the street in Tehran, for example, to protest, to demonstrate against these murderous jihadists, while realizing you can be shot in your head, or you can lose your eye or an arm, or you can end up as a woman being raped, being gang raped, like these two nurses. Well, that is a courage that I cannot imagine. And I have so much respect for that. There is nothing and there is no one that I respect more than people who have that courage. And of course, many lost their lives doing this. So, the regime has to fall now.
Exactly.
It has to fall.
Exactly. And we wish the same, that this happened. And you mentioned about the Iranian diaspora. How do you evaluate the role of Iranian diaspora during the Sun and Lion movement? How do you evaluate it?
Well, amazing. I mean, like I just said, these people are fighting, not in Iran, but they're fighting here. And they are so energetic on the streets, online. I see it every day. Every day they're posting things, they're spreading things online. Every week there are many demonstrations everywhere, and they come out with the flags, with all sorts of things. You know, I was there many times, of course. I go to these demonstrations as much as possible, and I see what a strong identity they have, and that they are willing to fight for that every day, even when they have a busy life here, because they all have jobs, they have a family, they have all things to do, but they're giving so much of their energy and time now to the elimination, let's hope, of the Islamic regime, and that gives me so much hope. You know, that gives me hope and motivation every day to at least try to help them as much as possible, because many Iranians come thank me, but I always turn it around. I say, I have to thank you, okay? Because what you're doing for Iran and for the Middle East is amazing, is so great, and it's not only good for Iran and the Middle East, it's also good for us, you know, because it gives also a signal in our society, which is decadent and lazy, okay? After so many decades of not having to fight for anything, actually, became very decadent and lazy. And it's good now that we see that there are people here who are not like that, who are willing to fight for their nationality, for their culture, for their identity. And so they also help our own society to become alive again and to de-Islamize also Belgium, you know, because, for example, in Antwerp, where I live and where I'm a city councillor, yeah, we had so many pro-Palestinian demonstrations, horrible. Every week, 2 years, more than 2 years, every week, Moroccans, Turks, people from all sorts of Muslim countries. But now finally, we also have demonstrations, big demonstrations, 1,000 people in Antwerp who come on the street against Islamization and against Islamic jihad. And that are the Iranian people.
از خاک کوچه های سرد با خون سرخ خود نوشتم تا رویم خنده ها زدن چون روز دیگر آید روحم جان سبزه هاست خورشید جاودان آزادی نور آسمان ماست سوگند خون همراهان سوگند عشق مادران هرگز به تیرشان نمیرد فریاد جاودان ماست سوگند خون همراهان سوگند عشق مادران هرگز به تیرشان نمیرد فریاد جاودان
The interesting point for me is that the only gathering that we can be able to see the Israeli flag is Iranian gathering.
Exactly.
And I'm really regretful to say that nobody dare to bring the Israel flag in European countries, in European gathering. And I'm so happy that the Iranian gathering is one of the safest place for the people that they want to admire their country, Israel.
Exactly.
What do you think about this?
Yeah, it says everything, of course. And the Israeli or Jewish people and the Iranian people, yeah, they are fighting the same fight in the Middle East, but also here on our streets. And unfortunately, I must say that, and we had a debate today in the parliament about it, that they also face the same intimidation and threats and attacks in Belgium and in Europe. I must say that it was not my policy and not my responsibility, but I'm so ashamed that Jewish people, Iranian people, good people, freedom-loving people in our society, on our streets and online also, have to fear sometimes for their safety because they get intimidated or they get death threats from people here who are here for the Islamic regime of the Islamic Republic. And that is the big tragedy of Belgium, of Europe, and of the West from the last decades, that we not only allowed in good people, for example, from Iran or Syria, but we also allowed in so many bad people, so many Muslim fundamentalists, so many jihadists, so many people who have bad ideas and bad intentions with our society. That is the big tragedy of Europe.
Exactly, because the point is about Iran. Historically, we had no problem with any religion, especially the Jewish people in Iran. As you know, Iran has a diversity of religion and tribes. And during the years, they lived together peacefully and nobody could divorce them from together. But during the last 47 years, you know that what happens to the religious minorities,
of course,
religious ethnics, and the gender minorities in the society.
Yeah, I know, for example, that the Baha'i people, that they are prosecuted in Iran, and that many of the Baha'i migrated to Israel, where they found a safe haven. And this is something that happens in every country that is being Islamized. You always see the same. That is that non-Muslims are in deep trouble. They get suppressed or they get killed. That's the only option they have. Or they have to convert to Islam, or they have to obey Sharia law, or they get killed. It's always the same in history of Islamic jihad. And the Buddhists experienced it, the Hindus, the Christians, the Zoroastrians, the Baha'i. I mean, you can name 50 minorities in the Middle East, non-Islamic minorities, and they all went through horrible genocides because of Islamic jihad. I mean, the history of Pakistan, the history of Afghanistan, the history of Syria, the history of countries like Sudan, Nigeria, we see always the same pattern. That is, Islamic jihad takes over, and non-Muslims, they are screwed.
In the future of Iran, especially in the transition time, how do you think the Westerners, especially the European Union, could help Iranian people toward going to the vote and the election for the freedom of Iran and for the future of Iran? How do you see the role of the Westerners, especially the European Union, in this case?
Well, that's a difficult question, because I think that, as I said before, that Reza Pahlavi has a great plan for doing this. And of course, I would say that Westerners, the EU, European leaders should support him as much as possible in doing this, in having free elections, in becoming a secular state in Iran. So we should support him as much as possible. I don't see an alternative. And I also think that we should be modest. I mean, it's not our country, Iran. It's not our country. So we should help where we can, and if it's necessary, and we should help Reza Pahlavi. But we should also not mind the business of the Iranians. It's their business, okay? And we should have faith in that they choose their own destiny for the future.
Whenever we are talking about the future of Iran, I can feel your emotions on your eyes. And maybe this is an emotional question, but I would like to ask, if the regime change happened in the future of Iran, if you would like to plan to go to Iran, where do you like to go the most?
That's a very difficult question. I cannot answer that. I mean, I've seen so many footage of Iran, and I know the diversity of the country. I know you have everything there. You have desert, you have mountains with snow, you have beautiful rivers, you have an amazing cultural heritage. So I would do a great tour, and probably I would start in the capital, Tehran. I mean, it is the capital, right? And I know many people there. So I think I would start there, but then, I would have to do a tour for at least many weeks, and come back, of course, because, it's a country that you can travel in for many months even, I would say.
Yes. For the end of our interview, I would like to talk directly to the Iranian people, which they love you, and they are watching our interview right now. I would like to talk with your camera toward the Iranian people and tell whatever you feel in your heart with the Iranian people directly.
Dear Iranians, my dear Iranian friends, you know that, see? Okay, I do it again. Okay.
No problem. Let me drink.
It's me.
No, it's not you. Okay. Dear Iranians, dear Iranian people, proud, courageous Iranians, you know that you're in my heart. And that's why I'm fighting for you every day, here in the parliament, but also as an activist on the street and on social media. I cannot wait to visit a free Iran, an Iran without a horrible Islamic Republic. And you know, in Israel, they have a saying, see you in Jerusalem. And I would like to rephrase that and tell you, see you in Tehran.
Thank you very much, Sam, and I deeply wish to meet together in free Iran, and we could be able to celebrate the freedom and democracy inside Iran and in Tehran. Thank you very much, and we wish you the best.
Vandaag schijnt de zon voor ons, voor jullie, voor het Iraanse volk, voor een vrij Iran. Het vernietigen van de Islamitische Republiek, dat is wat er moet gebeuren. Er zijn maar 2 landen die dat durven, die dat kunnen, die de moed hebben om dat te doen en die daar vandaag mee bezig zijn. En dat zijn de VS en Israël. Dat is president Donald Trump en Bibi Netanyahu. Het Iraanse volk is niet alleen moedig, het is ook een volk met zoveel talent, met zoveel potentieel, met mensen die vooruit willen in het leven, die hard werken, die ook België, Vlaanderen en Antwerpen verrijken. Doordat jullie vandaag en vorige week in Brussel zo moedig op straat komen en doordat jullie op sociale media zo moedig jullie stem laten horen, helpen jullie mee de strijd te voeren in België, in Antwerpen, tegen de islamisering van onze samenleving. Dank jullie daarvoor. Dat gaat over het sluiten van de Iraanse ambassade. Dat gaat over het uitzetten van alle IRGC-agenten en alle aanhangers van Ayatollah Khamenei. En ik hoop, en ik zal de strijd daarvoor blijven voeren, dat ik samen met jullie binnenkort een vrij Iran kan bezoeken. Een vrij seculier Iran. Met de wijze, intelligente, moedige Reza Pahlavi. Op mij zullen jullie altijd kunnen rekenen. Altijd. Ik ben at your service.
Ayatollah Khamenei is dead.